Welcome to another Dr. Sadler's Honest Review. This is a series in which I review usually fairly recent books within philosophy focused on the practical side of philosophy, how it impacts our day-to-day life, how we make decisions, how we ought to behave. And so, of course, that bleeds over into many other fields like those of leadership or ethics more broadly or self-help, or in this case, the area of mindfulness. And so the book that I'm reviewing today is called Mindfulness and the Big Questions, Philosophy for Now. And the author is Ben Irvine, and it was published in 2017 with Hare Press, which is an imprint of Quarto. So it's actually quite an attractive little volume here. I'll show you what it looks like right there. And so as always with these, I'm going to talk a little bit about the style structure, the summary, some of the key ideas of the book, some of the things that I think are good points about it, some of the things that I find problematic, and then give you some final verdict. But I'll say right off the bat, I'm going to give this a mixed review. There are some really good features about this book. There are some things that I find lacking or off base or underdeveloped as well in the book. And so, whether or not you would want to get your hands on this will probably depend on which of those matter more to you, the positive aspects or the things that I thought were problematic. I like to begin with the three big S's, a summary of the work, which the author is in fact providing us with at several different points, a discussion of the work's style, and a sort of overall structure. And so let's actually start with the last one first, because that's fairly easy to discuss. So it's divided into 7 chapters, and then there's, a very short further reading set of recommendations. There's an index, and then there are some acknowledgments at the very end of it. And the chapters are divided up along the lines, with the exception of the very first one, along the lines of what we can call the big questions, which makes good sense because this is called Mindfulness and the Big Questions. And when we're using that term big questions in philosophy, we generally mean the sorts of things that actually provide chapter headings here and, sort of boxes in which we put a whole bunch of related topics. So the first one is called Hidden in Plain Sight, and it's kind of an introduction to the whole point of the work and, making an argument for why mindfulness would be a good thing to do, meditation would be a good thing to do. It tells you a little bit of the story of the author, which we'll talk about in a bit. And then the second chapter is called Why Am I Here? So really big question, right? What's the point of me being here in this body? Am I just my body? Am I something besides my body? Why am I in the particular place that I am? The second chapter, do I really know anything? That might make you think that it's really just about epistemology, but actually, there's a lot of practical concerns built into that. And then we have a big heavy hitter, am I free, right? So the question of freedom and determinism and what causality is, these are metaphysical questions. Is there a higher power, bringing in the question of God or whatever else we want to consider? Does that make any impact in our life? Chapter 6 is what makes a life good. So we're looking at ethics in a very broad sense there. And then the rather short chapter 7 is called What Does It All Mean? And you can look at that as having to do with the meaning of life, but also a way of bringing an end to the section. And I will say, each chapter has a bunch of different sections to it. Some of them are kind of long, some of them are kind of short, and they're set up pretty well. There's it begins with a set of questions that we should think about and raise. And then there'll be discussions about issues, usually at some point in the chapter, not always at the very end, but, sometimes close to the end, there'll be a meditation or practical exercise that one would carry out. And so it's, kind of a guided, structured way of doing that. And, then the stuff that you'd want to look up at the very end of it, all these references that the author is making, you're going to find, either in the index or in the further reading, which I'll talk a little bit about later on. So let's talk then about the summary. I mentioned that the author gives us a kind of summary. So actually the very back cover reads like this: face up to life, existential anxiety, a fear of our very existence is something we all have to deal with in our lives. Some of us try to escape from this fear through hiding in the distractions that modern life offers us. Some of us turn to philosophy, but alas, philosophers throughout the ages have rarely offered good advice on how to face up to life. This book explores how mindfulness can enhance our understanding of who and where we are, enabling us to come to terms with our existence and embrace being here now. So that tells you really, he's laying his position out. Philosophers have, rarely offered good advice on how to face up to life. We're going to consider that question in a bit, but I have the recipe for you now, and it's sort of a farrago or mix brought together. If one wants to be charitable, an integration of some insights from philosophy and some insights from psychology and some things taken from mindfulness and some things taken from philosophy coming from the East now, and we're going to talk about the use of that in a bit as well, and some stories about ordinary life and the author's own experiences, some pop culture references, all of these brought together to try to help people understand their life and to live a better life. So you could say that it is a philosophical work in that the author is taking a sort of like right now perspective and saying, what can we make of the human condition in its many different points at the present, given the tools and resources that we have available right now. And, he's got a couple other places where he says some interesting things that I marked. So here we go. After discussing mindfulness and cognitive behavior therapy, he says that my small answers to the big questions are like a course of CBT, that is cognitive behavior therapy, for people who suffer from existential anxiety, which he thinks is everybody. At least, we should be. Right? When we follow the example of most philosophers, when we distract ourselves from existence by hiding in life, denying answers to the big questions, we deliberately lose ourselves in tangled thickets of thought. Through my life-affirming small answers, I learned to beat a path through the confusion of life-denying philosophy. Yet, until I discovered mindfulness, I was still tangled up in the big questions. I was turning the small questions over and over in my mind like a record player. Meditation and mindfulness helped to create an inner space whereby I could distance myself from my chronic philosophizing. And then I really experienced the small answers, not just abstractly, but vividly and directly. And the small answers came alive through my mindful experience, and I'm now offering this to you as a possibility as well. So you notice the same sort of stance on what philosophy has to offer. Here he talks about it being what he's offering here being sort of like a cognitive behavior therapy approach. So that's, interesting as well. And then there's another passage a little bit later in the work. Here we go. And he says, when you think about it, this entire book is an exercise in converting existential anxiety into a rational analysis of human existence. Through this analysis, I hope to convince you that you needn't be afraid of your existence, but within this broader project, we can also use rational analysis to challenge some of our specific fears about uncertainty. And I think that's kind of emblematic for, where the book is going and where it's coming from. What else to say about it in terms of style? It's very readable. I think that he's a good writer. at least in the sense of how he writes. It's well put together. The book itself is quite attractive aesthetically, the way that it has been developed, and it's quite nice to look at, right? It feels good in the hand, very well laid out. What else should we say? So there's two other elements that I want to bring up. So it is a sort of self-help book, which is based in philosophy and incorporating, some research and techniques that are developed in the present. And it's engaging in a good bit of storytelling as well, which is quite interesting. Ben Irvine, narrates his own course of thinking these things through, and I think that's kind of, at least for me, I find that interesting and valuable. He also coins a lot of, not a lot. He coins some new terms, sometimes in ways that can be helpful. There's one, for example, he calls it remindfulness and opposes it to mindfulness. He says this state of being tacitly aware of our freedom, even when we're acting spontaneously, could be called remindfulness. It's an important part of mindfulness. It's how mindfulness echoes in spontaneous behavior, enabling us to return to our freedom whenever we hit obstacles. And it's also how we naturally return to mindfulness even when things are going well. And he talks about an oscillation between mindfulness and remindfulness. Okay, so that's kind of interesting. He also talks about world side, self side and God side. And these are sort of elements or perspectives that we're supposed to be putting together rather than being substance dualists or monists or things like that. That's something that he proposes, and he's got his own terminology for that. And authors can do that. There's nothing wrong with it. And the way that he brings them up, I don't think that they're going to lend themselves to misunderstanding. So the neologisms are probably, quite appropriate to the work. That's probably enough about the summary, the style, and the structure of the work. So what are some key ideas from the work that can give you a good sense about what this book is about and whether you'd want to get your hands on a copy? The first thing is of course, he's exploring what he's calling existential anxiety, and he's trying to explain in a way that I think really essentially follows the existentialists like Heidegger or Sartre or people like that, how we all feel it on some level, but we submerge it or repress it or distract ourselves from it. And how when you really feel it, it can be debilitating. And so we want to find a way past that. I would say that is a really key thing. And then, so we're going to put together, in his view, mindfulness exercises and the notion of mindfulness, or, as earlier philosophers called it, attentiveness, reflection, all these sorts of things. Because the idea of mindfulness has been around for a very long time in Western philosophy, as well as in Eastern thought. Mindfulness, cognitive techniques, he's talking in terms of CBT, but again, very broad spectrum of cognitive techniques available to us, whether it's in psychology, whether it's in ancient philosophy, or in other things as well. And then bringing insights in from philosophy and examining them and thinking, one other thing is thinking about the different range of positions that are available that we can pick and choose from and critically examining them. That's one thing that's going on over and over again in the book. I think this notion of, small answers to the big questions, that's kind of a cool thing to bring up. I mean, the book is oriented around traditional big questions of philosophy. Not all of them, of course, but the ones that the author felt were the most important. And I think it's actually a quite good selection of those classic questions. And, maybe there is something to this notion that we need life-size answers rather than just like super big idealistic answers to these questions. That's kind of an interesting point as well. Thinking through these key philosophical questions, thematizing them, that's a good bit of what this book is doing. Obviously, it's rather selective in which things it's going to focus on, but that's the prerogative of any author, isn't it? There are a lot of concepts being brought in from psychology. Great example of this would be, the notion of learned helplessness or that of depersonalization. These are sort of, classic at this point in time psychological. They like the word constructs. In philosophy, we say concepts or ideas or notions or dynamics. And many of those have things to offer us, I think. And so, the book itself is an attempt to, I think, on the part, sort of like Descartes' Meditations, right? It's an attempt on the author's part to show us where he's been in his thinking, and then to offer to us, the readers, the chance to go down those same paths ourselves and to, think about whether we buy into it or not. And so, with each chapter, we can look at different matters that are being brought up. So let's just take the example of the chapter "Do I Really Know Anything?", which begins by talking about everyone knowing where they were on 9/11 and uncertainty. Now, notice that he's not just talking about epistemology in the sense of like get to your problems or stuff like that. It's uncertainty that we're actually facing in our real lives. And so how do we experience uncertainty? Why do we feel uncertain? There's a great line right here. Perhaps many of us feel uncertain because we lack satisfying social relationships. That's an interesting idea. Then he brings up the Truman Show. He talks about the issue of self-absorption and how this can be existential, and then discusses skepticism and René Descartes, some Eastern philosophy, and the idea of Maya. And then he tells us that skepticism and idealism are manifestations of an extreme form of self-absorption, existential self-absorption. It could be called a symptom of existential anxiety, a symptom of fearing being here now. And, this is where you might say, oh, that's an interesting take on skepticism and idealism. It's an interesting opposition that's being made there. I'm not sure I entirely buy into it, but, you could at least check it out. And then, he gives you like a discussion here of a kind of exercise you can do, how to persuade somebody to accept reality. And the first part is, just realizing that you have to know something, and then, revisiting Descartes, realizing that yourself exists. And then he says, Descartes can't be right because you can't build a self out of ethereal mental states the self is supposed to underpin. Whether that's an accurate depiction of Descartes, we'll talk about later. Then he brings in David Hume, talking about how, in our practical life, we're not really skeptics. And then he goes on and brings in Donald Davidson, says we may go plenty wrong, but only on condition in most respects we are right. So he's essentially adopting cognitive approaches. And then finally he talks about G. Moore and his famous "here's a hand," this is sort of the way the text goes. So that gives you a good idea of what you'd be getting into. What do I like about this work, or what do I find positive or good about this work? What are the things that would recommend it to you as a reader? I talked about the aesthetics of it. It's a nice looking work to begin with. And, as I pointed out earlier, it's very readable. So I think, you could put this in somebody's hands as like a present and say, hey, you want to study some philosophy? Check out what this guy has to say. Maybe it'll, provoke some thoughts on your part. I think that there is also some nice storytelling done by Irvine about his own journey and how he arrived at the conclusions that he's providing you with in this work. And I'll say a few other things as well. There are a lot of, let's call them useful reflections, reasonings, practices, distinctions being made here. I think they're useful largely as starting points and not as sort of like, the last word on any of these things or genuinely, comprehensive analyses of these. And so sometimes even when they're wrong, which does happen in this book, they can be at least useful. They can be thought-provoking. And there are some interesting adaptations. He calls them meditations in here. I would call them philosophical practices. They're like, what Ado talks about as spiritual exercises. There's a lot of words for these sorts of things. But, there's some nice cognitive, and affective and practical things that you do under the rubric of meditation in this book. And so I think that's a valuable component of it right there, some of which he has created himself. And I think that's always cool when an author is able to add to the stock of philosophical practices that are out there. I think there's also, there's a lot of critiques of philosophy in this, right? So going back to the back, philosophers throughout the ages have rarely offered good advice on how to face up to life. So he's criticizing where not the philosophers themselves, but maybe like the, second, third hand versions of those philosophers and their viewpoints go wrong. So the Wikipedia version of them, maybe, some of that is it's good to criticize that. And it's good to say, hey, you don't want to just go in that direction. They didn't manage to address this thing over here. But it's usually more like a summary of the philosopher than the actual philosopher and his or her works that are doing that. But I think that could be useful for some people, right? Again, nice and thought-provoking. I will say that there are a lot of decent discussions going on in here. I'll single one out about self-control, which is kind of interesting. I mean, it echoes something that we find, for example, in readings of Aristotle and Acrasia, right? So he tells us that self-control is important, and sometimes it's okay to allow yourself some indulgence, right? He says, here we go. Anyone who's ever studied for an exam, trained for a sporting event, or rehearsed for a concert will tell you that the best way to keep up a regime of self-control is to allow oneself occasional modest pleasures. Pleasure in moderation is a reward for self-control. The reward motivates the effort that justifies the reward that motivates the effort, and so on. And he says, when a self-controlled person allows himself to experience pleasure in moderation, he loosens control of himself without losing control. I like that. That's a nice distinction, nice way of framing it. I think that's an insight that you can, take home and put in the bank, so to speak. I think it would be better if it was brought into greater, engagement with like classic treatments of that or other contemporary treatments. But that's good. I'm not going to take away from what's particularly good in that. So there are, quite a few things that I would say, would recommend this work to at least to some readers. What do I find problematic about this book? There's quite a few points where I have some disagreements or some criticisms to make, and some of them may be, deal breakers for you as a reader. Some of them might be things that you're willing to overlook, and that's up to you to think about, but it's up to me to put them in front of you. So the first thing that I'm going to say is that the engagement with actual philosophers, their texts, their systems, their ways of doing things is often very superficial in this work, and in some respects I would say stereotyped, right? So Descartes gets read not as Descartes, but as sort of a, as I mentioned, second or third hand, intro to philosophy presentation of Descartes. And to me that's problematic. Because if we're going to say that, as Ben Irvine is, the philosophers aren't supplying us with the answers, you actually have to go to the text and see whether they did supply you with the answers. And if you're going to say that they said this, you really have to make sure that they actually did present things the way that you're saying they did. And in some cases they didn't in this work. So that's a problem. I'll give you a few examples of that. So here we go. He says, philosophers tend to retreat from life. Many of them lack normal social contact. Many live as though in a dream, adrift of reality. And then he says this derealization takes these two forms in reality of skepticism and idealism. And he, that's a very sweeping statement. It doesn't correspond to my experience of my peers as philosophers. It might correspond to Irvine's experience, but I don't know how you even would back up something like that. And I think that appeals to something in some readers that is going to be detrimental to them. They'll be, oh yeah, man, I know what that's like, and they're using their own inadequate experience, depriving themselves of the experience of engaging with philosophers who don't fit that bill. Another example is on page 108. Here we go. Where he's talking about Kant, right? And he tells us that he's talking about Kant's noumenal realm and says, we can't know anything about it. Well, no, Kant says that we can know something about it in the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals if you read to the third part, right? So, we actually learn more about it in moral practical life than we do from a theoretical perspective. So there's kind of a misrepresentation of Kant going on here. A little bit later on, let me see. No, that's probably enough examples already. What else? There's some appeals to Eastern, modes of thought as opposed to Western. I understand. I'm not going to say that you can't talk about the term Eastern at all, but each of them is as vast a cultural field and as varied as Western philosophy is. So if we're talking about Indian or Chinese philosophy, there's a vast thing there, and we don't want to generalize under the rubric of Eastern. There's some discussion of Hinduism. There's some discussion of Buddhism. The Buddhist discussion is almost completely taken from one school of Buddhism, which is an important school, but is not representative of Buddhism as a whole, and that's Zen. There's, some references to Alan Watts, which I always find a little suspicious. They're kind of shortcuts. What we want is, if we're going to talk about Buddhism or Hinduism or Taoism, and Taoism, the contemporary way of spelling it is with a D rather than a T, which makes you, what's going on here? What texts are being relied on here? You really want to go to the source texts and provide more and respect the differentiation within the traditions. So that's something that I found a little bit off in it. I'll also say that the second to last chapter was deeply unsatisfying, where it's treating ethics. For example, there's this reference to Stoics and existentialists, spelling, with a lowercase s, which, okay, there is a difference between the two, but, saying that here's how we can summarize their points of view in two sentences. Philosophers who are existentialists encourage us to recognize our choices and attitudes influence whether we become happy or not, and philosophers who are Stoics argue we can only be truly happy when we've mastered our feelings and emotions. That's only the tiniest bit of Stoicism. And Stoics also, like existentialists, say that we have to recognize our choices and attitudes influence whether we become happy or not. as do eudaimonists, who he talks about, which would include presumably Aristotle. So there's a lot of kind of sloppy one-sentence summaries of entire vast schools of philosophy and why they don't have that much to contribute by comparison to Ben Irvine. So that's, it's straw manning quite a lot throughout the entire thing. I think this is a problem. Later on, he's got this reference to postmodernists, and it does, this is not something I can recognize as a good description of it. Postmodernism is a bizarre blend of moral determinism, moral perspectivism, and idealism. According to the postmodernist, our morality is always the morality of our society, moral determinism, but we collectively choose this morality, moral perspectivism, just as we create our reality through our shared beliefs, idealism. No. That's not postmodernism. That's jumping on the bandwagon of criticizing postmodernism when you really mean something like relativism or consumerism or some other thing that you don't like. And so it's not doing any work here other than like appealing to people who already buy into some postmodernism is bad sort of thing. So that's a problem. There's I would say a rather superficial treatment of 4 different approaches in ethics. Typically, it's nice that he brought in more than just utilitarianism, deontology, and virtue ethics, but the depictions of them are sort of like, these are the sort of things that you see in forums where people have only read a bit, and they're not real presentations of them. And then he talks about sentimentalism, and then kind of bizarrely endorses G.E. Moore and his Principia Ethica as like the way to go beyond these forms. It's kind of refreshing to find people who think that Moore is a great philosopher, because it's pretty rare, and I'm saying that not just to like appeal to popularity or something. It's pretty rare because Principia Ethica, it's an interesting book, but it's not a very good book of ethics, and that direction is, it's kind of hard to say anything good about it. So, there's some deeply unsatisfying things in here. There's a lot of places where you're like, yeah, okay, I can see how you could go in that direction, but I don't know why you had to like, bash or downgrade or stereotype all these other people along the way. Just come straight out and say what it is that you want, right? And then it would have been a much, much stronger book had it been much more positive in incorporating more than just a few endorsements of like, say G. Moore, right? Or another favorite in here is Arthur Schopenhauer. So those are some problematic aspects, I think. The other thing that I'll say is the further reading, very idiosyncratic and not really that well connected to what's in the book. So it includes, Dawkins' God Delusion and Chalmers' The Conscious Mind. Okay, those are good things. Jules Evans' Philosophy for Life and Other Dangerous Situations. He includes his own book, Einstein and the Mindful Cycling. Steven Pinker, and then the only philosophers from past philosophy, as opposed to contemporary stuff, that he's actually referencing here in a book where he's brought up Descartes and brought up, all these other thinkers over the course of it, are Sartre and Schopenhauer. And the Sartre is a reference to nausea, which makes sense because he's talking about the chestnut tree. But he also brings up some stuff that should be from, existentialism as a humanism, and that's just not there. So the further reading is not particularly helpful, I would say, for somebody coming to this book for the first time. So those are quite a few things that I've registered there. But I think we have to be brutally honest in a Sadler's honest review. All right, my final thoughts on this book. I think that, I'm going to give it a qualified endorsement if you want to read a book that, does say some interesting things about mindfulness and has some decent exercises worked out in it. Even if you disagree with the author on some of the ways in which he's going and some of the, let's call them frankly, misrepresentations of classic all the way down to contemporary philosophical authors and positions. If you get past that and you look at what's good in the book, I mean, it might be a nice book for you to have. It's not too pricey and it's quite attractive, and it could be a good book for provoking thoughts on your part. It could also be a decent gift to give people. It's definitely not the sort of book that you want to take as articulating the last word, or even one of the last words in a selection on the topics that it's discussing. But it could be a nice book for somebody to receive as a gift or to lend somebody, which is probably what I'm going to do with it myself. And it could lead to actually saying, okay, he says this about Descartes. Let me read Descartes and see what Descartes actually says, or Hume actually says, or Kant actually says. Right? That would be quite good. Qualified endorsement of it. There's some good points. There's some bad points, and that's what I have to say.